Dr. Tom Cowan, welcome back to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
It's always good to see you again, Kim. And happy birthday.
Although thank you.
Maybe I shouldn't have said that.
It's all right. Thank you. Okay, we're going round two with this one. Do viruses exist? Thank you for being back on the show and talking about this with us. I think our last guest, we had Dr. Cowan, I think is how I say his last name. And he was on the show. And when I asked him about whether, and he worked with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on the book, and asked him if viruses exist and if he thought that they existed. And his answer was quite vague and it was confusing to the audience. And that answer was, well, there's evidence that maybe, like, basically he said there's evidence that there's no evidence that they exist, but there's evidence that they exist. I mean, that's kind of what he said. It was like, they don't have the viruses themselves.
His job is to confuse people.
Okay. So let's hash this out.
Got to clear this up.
Yeah. And last time when you were on the show, I have to say I got a lot of emails from people, from viewers that said they weren't quite sure yet. They weren't sure if your argument was enough for them to buy viruses not existing.
Okay.
So let's try this again. And I don't know if I bought it either. And I think the reason was because the argument that you made last time was we don't have evidence of them existing, so therefore they don't exist. I mean, unless we have the hard evidence, then we can't. It's like saying, and you used an adoption metaphor of a person who had been adopted, and then someone said, "Well, who are your real parents?" And he says, "Well, I don't know." And then the guy says, "Well, then I don't know if you're adopted, because if you can't show me who your real parents are, then then I don't believe you've been adopted." So. But to me, that's just because
that's how science works. There's a claim,
okay,
right? And you investigate or try to falsify the claim. It's not competing theories.
Okay, so tell us again how. And I think for the average person in our mind, we think that, of course, viruses exist. They're looking at them under a microscope. Right? Like that's what they're doing, right? I mean, that's how they figured out.
That's what they say.
Okay. So what's the truth?
Right. But if it's okay, and we talked about this for a minute, I think we should start at the beginning.
Okay.
Again. And I'm going to try to do as quickly and clearly and succinctly as possible.
Okay.
Okay. So there's two, quote, viral illnesses which are in the news these days: measles and bird flu. So our first question is, are these actually real diseases, meaning specific syndromes? Now, again, I don't know if this annoys you, but I'm going to ask you because I think it'll help your audience to hear you think about these things, and then I'll jump in.
Okay.
So let's talk about bird flu. What are the symptoms? In other words, when you look at a bird, a chicken, how do you know it has bird flu?
Well, I don't know about bird flu. I don't know how I would know that they have bird flu.
Measles. How do you know that a child who's sick has measles?
There's a rash.
So is the rash the only reason a child has a rash is measles?
No, but it's a distinctive rash.
According to the CDC, the symptoms of measles are fever, mucus, and a rash. And They say clearly that you cannot distinguish by looking at a child who has measles as opposed to, I wrote down, chickenpox, rubella, scarlet fever, Kawasaki disease, drug eruptions, erythema infectiosum, parvovirus, roseola, or a number of other diseases. And in fact, they've done tests with experienced pediatricians and line up 100 children with rashes, and they can't agree on who has measles and who has any of these other things. In other words, it's a fact, according to everybody looking at this, that you cannot diagnose measles by looking at a child.
Okay.
That's what they say. That's why you have to do a test. Now, the same thing if you say, what is symptoms of bird flu? are a chicken who doesn't lay as many eggs, who has a respiratory symptoms, and then sometimes dies. Now, I'm not an animal expert, but I happen to look up here's are the other things that cause those exact same symptoms. In other words, chickens with snotty noses, chickens who stop laying as much, and chickens who die. There's infectious coryza, fowl cholera, chronic respiratory disease, infectious bronchitis, gapeworm, Newcastle, avian flu, and some others. And causes of decreased egg production, molting, chicken mites, chicken lice, stress, etc.
Okay.
In other words,
what about like chicken pox though? Because I feel like that rash is really distinct.
It is not. Nobody will claim if you show 100 children with chicken pox, nobody can say this for sure is a disease called chicken pox. That's what the CDC says. That's what everybody who looks into this, who looks at this, will say. That's what they're talking.
I mean, that just seems hard to believe to me because it just seems like I would know if, I mean, I haven't seen chickenpox in a long time.
How would you know that it's chickenpox?
Well, I mean, I feel like you could tell by looking at a kid that has chickenpox. They've got chickenpox all over them.
If you had 100 children with chickenpox and 100 children with measles, you could reliably tell the difference.
Yeah, I think so with those two.
How would you know that you're correct?
Well, I wouldn't know unless I did the test, but that's the thing. They can do a test.
So let's forget about the test. If you think about that, you see any test has to be compared to a gold standard. In other words, with pregnancy, you can tell for sure whether a woman is pregnant because there's a baby inside
Right.
and the baby comes out.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So then you can do a test, like a urine test, on 100 women who you know have a baby. And if one of them is negative, then you have a test that has a false negative rate of 1%.
Okay.
And if you do it on 100 men, it used to be when Biden was president, men could get pregnant, but now they can't.
Right.
So if you do it on 100 men and 2 are positive, then you have a 2% false positive rate.
Okay.
And then you can do the test. And you say, then you know. But with measles or bird flu, because there's no way to be sure who has it, how can you do a test?
Well, but that's the thing, is it that they do have tests?
What are you going to rely on, like pregnancy, to be so that you're sure what the false positive and negative rate is?
Well, if you take 100 kids that you suspect of having measles and you test, then couldn't you test? I mean, well, I'm not a scientist, but I would imagine.
Yeah, but you can think. You're a smart person.
Sure. So what I'm thinking is that they've been able to somehow isolate and figure out whatever, particles of that virus that they could then detect. I mean, that's what they were doing with COVID, right? They were going around saying, well,
we'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
But the first thing I want people to think about is, are these actually distinct diseases? And if how do we know that for sure? Not you assume that they're distinct. You should be able to prove that this is one entity and this is a different one.
I would imagine
that you can't.
Okay, but like
Measles,
with chickenpox, like when I was a kid, we had a chickenpox party. One of my cousins got chickenpox, then we all got chickenpox. So we know now all of us had chickenpox because we were all hanging out together and we all ended up with that same rash. So couldn't they then say, well, this is the same one disease, and we can then isolate that same one disease and then create a test for that?
It could if you could tell which is chickenpox by looking at somebody, and everybody who's studied this says you can't do that. That's why they do the test.
But they've been able to create the test. So how do they create the test?
Right. So they take. So here's how they. So in other words, you have to do a test. But the first point I want to make is we haven't yet proved that these are distinct entities. so that we have something that we can reliably compare it to like pregnancy, so that we know the error rate in the test. And that's according to the CDC. They say you cannot diagnose measles based on observation of the child because the rash and the symptoms look the same. The same with chickenpox. You have to do a test. The first problem is if there's no observational, like pregnancy, again, what are you going to compare the test to make sure that it's correct? Since you can't know whether they had measles or not.
A healthy person.
Okay. So in other words, if a person who's not sick, a child who's not sick, so that means if they're sick, they have measles.
Well, if they're sick, they're sick. And if it's the same sickness, 100 kids that look all very similar and they're all together, then you could deduce that they all have the same illness. And you could compare that to a healthy 100. And then I would imagine figure out what particle it is, or whatever, that is creating the illness. Like, wouldn't you be able to isolate the illness by comparing the 100 sick people that you suspect have the same illness because of proximity and whatnot?
The key word is suspect. We're talking about proving that they have the same illness. And if you do that, and in other words, if you take 100 children, like I said, and they've done studies on this, some of them you say have chickenpox, some of them you say have measles, some of them you say have scarlet fever. The symptoms are almost identical. And then you show them to 100 experienced pediatricians, they can't tell the difference.
Okay.
So there's no gold standard like pregnancy to tell you this is a certain disease.
Okay.
So you have to do a test.
Right. Okay.
Let's talk about the test.
Okay. Let's talk about the test. Because that to me would be, okay, so then you've created a test and you could test for this one particular virus, and then you test the 100 kids, and it turns out only half of them have measles.
Right. If it's true that there is a particular virus, and so then you could say these children with this rash, they have measles because they have a virus, this virus. These children with this rash have a different virus, then the test would be the gold standard. And in fact, that's what the CDC says. You can't diagnose bird flu without a test. You can't diagnose COVID because it has the same symptoms as the flu and a lot of other things without a test.
Sure.
So it's all based on the test.
Right.
My point here is the first problem is we don't have anything to standardize the test against, unlike pregnancy, right? So we're looking for a specific virus in this case that will be the answer, right? So now the next question is, how did they find the bird flu virus? What's the answer?
I mean, I don't know what a virus looks like, so I don't know how you would look for it.
Okay. So the first thing I want people to think about is the test. So there's 3 tests. There's PCR, there's antigen, antibody. These are all either pieces of the virus or reactions allegedly to the virus, right?
Okay.
PCR is a piece of the genetic material supposedly from the virus.
Right.
The antigen is a protein supposedly from a virus.
Right.
Okay. First question. Is it true that in order to say that a piece came from something, like a piece of fur came from an invisible unicorn, you have to have found the unicorn first?
Right.
Is that true? You agree with that?
I agree with you, yeah.
So in other words, in order to say the PCR proves the virus or an antigen proves the virus, you have to find the virus first.
Well, hold on. Let me backtrack on that. If I find fur, what I can say is this is fur from something I have never seen. So that is, I can't say it was a unicorn, But what I could say is it's not from a dog. It's not from a cat. It's not from it's not, this is fur from something I've never ever seen. Let's say it's like whatever fur. It's totally different. It's rainbow fur. I've never seen this rainbow fur.
Right.
So I can at least deduce that it's coming from something I've never seen before, and I should look for whatever has rainbow fur.
Right. So you have to find, but in order to, and again, as you said, you have to look for something that has rainbow fur. And unless you find something that has rainbow fur, you can't say it's from the thing that has rainbow fur.
No, but I would be able to say that this rainbow fur did not come from the cat, the dog, the
if
sheep.
It's something specific enough that it's so that's a good point, because there's two conditions for using a test. One is that you prove it came from the thing that you say it did, and two, you prove that it didn't come from anything else.
Right.
So you jump to the second one, but you still have to do the first one.
Well, I don't necessarily know if I have to identify what the animal is that the fur comes from, right? I just need to say it doesn't come from any of these healthy animals that are around me. So it's coming from something else. So I would think that that's the same with a virus. I could say, I found this strange particle and it doesn't belong with any of these healthy people. So it's coming from something that's making them sick. I don't know if I have to know specifically yet.
So then all you can then say is it's coming from something.
Right, but
That's
it's real.
Not the proof of a virus.
Why isn't it?
Could be something else.
Like what?
Who knows? Because you don't need to know that. The claim is it's coming from a specific virus.
Well, it's coming from something that's making you sick.
How do you know it's making you sick? Just because it's there?
Well, it's there and it's odd, yeah.
So if firemen are at a fire, that means that the firemen caused the fire.
No, well, okay. I see what you're saying there. Sure. But that's kind of like what people, not to totally derail, but that's kind of what people say about cancer. I'm hearing that a lot about cancer. Like, just because the cancer's there, it doesn't mean the cancer's causing the sickness. The cancer could be the thing that's, a symptom of the sickness, of whatever's the actual sickness. Like, I've been hearing that a little bit from people. I don't know if it's true or not.
If you're going to say something is the cause of something.
Right.
If you say a hammer knocks in the nail, you have to separate the hammer, hit the nail with it, go like this so you're sure it's not your arm, or think nail go in, and then you prove that it was just the hammer that hit the nail in. So we need to prove that there's a particle that this piece came from, this fur came from, right? An animal who the fur came from, and it doesn't belong to any other animal, right?
Right.
So then the question is, how did they do that? Now, you could say they went to somebody, one of these people with the bird flu or chickenpox or measles, and they take snot or mucus or blood, and they looked through a microscope and they saw a unique particle.
Right.
Except they all say they've never done that. They say you can't do that. There is no question about that. They say there's not enough of these particles to see. There's 225 or so Freedom of Information requests to the CDC and the NIH and Robert Koch Institute, et cetera. Show us pictures of purified or these unique particles from any fluid of anybody who's sick. They say that you cannot do in virology.
So
everybody agrees with that.
We're able to do that with bacteria, right? We're able to isolate.
With bacteria, you can find bacteria. That's not the same as saying they caused the illness.
Sure, but you can see bacteria.
You can see bacteria.
But you cannot see a virus?
No, I'll get to that in a minute.
Well, what about like when...
you can't see it in the chickenpox lesion or in the snot of somebody with measles, or if you stick a thing down a bird's nose,
yeah,
you cannot see the bird flu virus.
Unlike bacteria,
Ever.
if I have a lesion, you can look at the lesion and see the bacteria.
Correct.
Like if I have MRSA or something.
If you
Then you can see it.
Stick to what you can see. You have a bad redness, pus on your skin. That's what you see, right?
Right.
Okay. With measles, you see somebody with a snotty nose and they have a rash. You take a sample of their fluid. The whole history of virology, there's not one paper that they found the virus in that snot. So how do they claim there's a virus there?
Right. How do they do that?
Because they do. And let me take a guess, 10,000 papers called the isolation of the measles virus, the chickenpox virus, the bird flu virus, etc. Right? How did they do it? So this started in 1954 with a paper from a guy named John Enders. So he took the snot of a child with measles, right? Were you with me?
Yeah.
He didn't look for a virus because they already knew they couldn't see it. Didn't do anything to it. Put that on a growing culture of monkey kidney cells. Added horse serum, bovine serum, calf serum, antibiotics that are poisonous to kidney cells. Took away the nutrients of the culture and watched it. 4 days later, the culture broke down, and he said that proves there was a measles virus. That's called the isolation of the measles virus.
But how are they able to
just
sequence?
To finish this for 1 minute,
okay,
he did the same thing, except he didn't add anything from anybody with measles, right? And he said the same thing happened. In other words, the cells broke down.
Okay. How are they able to sequence in order to create vaccines or tests?
Wait a minute, that was a big leap there. Because
Okay.
people have to understand that since 1954, that is how they prove the existence of a virus.
So how do they explain the fact they can't see it like they can bacteria?
So they took this snot, right, on the monkey kidney cells.
Yeah.
Put kidney antibiotics in, took away the nutrients, added horse serum, fetal bovine serum. The thing breaks down. They look under the electron microscope. By the way, it broke down the same as when they didn't add anything from measles, proving that it had nothing to do with measles, right? Right? I mean, isn't that accurate?
Right. Okay.
Because they got the same result whether they added anything with snot or not.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been repeated about 10 times. And I repeated it with Stefan Lenka. I funded it. We got a lab. We did the same thing. And we found that cells broke down. We didn't add anything from anybody who was sick. So it's just the procedure. Then they have this broken down cells, and they look at it, and they say, those are particles, and those we call the measles virus. That's the particles that you referred to that they're seeing.
Okay.
Now, the problem with that is they then do this. They look with an electron microscope of the broken down cells that didn't have the measles snot in it, right?
Okay.
They see the identical particles. They did that with COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2. They show you particles with the spike, etc. And then there was papers written. They did it from kidney biopsies from before 2000. Identical particles.
Mm-hmm.
They said nobody can distinguish breaking down kidney cells or lung cancer cells from what you're calling a virus. And in fact, somebody sent me just 2 days ago, fetal bovine serum, which they add to every cell culture, is known to have particles which are indistinguishable from viruses. And they add that to every culture. So there's no way they can say that particle that you say they're seeing is a virus or from the lungs of the person who had measles or the kidney cells or the fetal bovine serum. That's called, That's a fraud. Now, that is how they say there's measles or bird flu or chickenpox or HIV or any virus is the same way. It's based on the culture. Now, to answer your question, they take that culture, right? And they say, okay, now let me just stop for a minute. We know that there's a lot of DNA and RNA in there that's not from a virus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's from the lungs of the person.
Right.
It's from the fetal bovine serum. It's from the kidney cells. They chop that up into little pieces and they put it in a computer and it spits out 1 million different possible ways of arranging those pieces. And then they choose one and say that is the genome of the virus.
Okay.
And when we did that, without adding anything from anybody with measles or HIV or anything, we got the genome of HIV. We got the genome of measles. We got the genome of SARS-CoV-2. Because if you take, especially if you add RNA from yeast, that helps because then you have more letter. This is like, in the original SARS-CoV-2, they had 56 million pieces.
Mm-hmm.
That's like 56 million letters.
Right.
And they said, computer, arrange those into War and Peace. And if you're the computer, you would have said, show me War and Peace first.
Right.
No, I'm not going to show you. You have to come up with War and Peace from 56 million letters. Okay, here's 1 million options. Now, here's the problem. How do you know which is the real War and Peace?
Right.
And how do you know it's the real SARS-CoV-2? How do you know it's the real measles virus? Because it didn't come from anything, right? It didn't come from anything. It came from the computer arranging the pieces, like letters in an alphabet, into 56 million, or with SARS-CoV-2, they got 1.4 million different possible combinations.
Yeah. Okay.
That's nuts.
Right. Okay. Okay.
That's what I mean.
So okay. Right. And I see that. So tell us what's the motive for doing that? Why are they doing it like that?
I mean, it's a great question and a silly question because how do I know what the motive is?
Well, I mean,
let me just say it like this. If you can convince the world, that's my pumpkin story. You know, Pumpkin's my cat. He goes out, he smells the air, he looks around. If you can convince Pumpkin that there's a danger that's going to kill him that he can't see, he's toast. So you've convinced the whole world that there's a danger which they don't see, they don't smell, they don't know, they don't even know, like, you know, Kennedy and Big Tree, they don't even know how you came up with the virus.
Yeah.
So you got all these people who are making policy and they don't even know how you know that this is true or not. In that situation, you can kill all the birds, you can control the world.
Okay,
and that's
so
what they're doing.
Let's back up a little bit on this. So,
is that right? I don't know, but that could be the motivation.
Sure. So let's back up. So you're saying that prior to so I don't know anything about the history of virology. Are you saying it didn't? It didn't exist before the 50s?
No. So here's how they proved the polio virus. Okay. This was it stopped in 1953, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
They saw children who had paralysis, right?
Yeah.
So they got an acute illness and paralysis. They said that's a new illness, must be from a bacteria. They looked in their spine where the illness was, right? So because they couldn't move, and they don't see a bacteria. So they say, must be something smaller than a bacteria. Let's call it a virus. It's one of the first ones. So in order to prove it, they took a child who died of paralysis, right? And they ground up the spine Now, they can't see anything because they don't have an electron microscope.
Yeah.
They grind up the spine, put a few chemicals in it, got 2 monkeys, injected 10 cc's into the monkey's brain, both monkeys. 1 monkey died, 1 got paralyzed. They say that proves it's an infectious, contagious disease caused by something smaller than a bacteria called a virus. And they did that for 50 years. That was 1908. Okay. Then, so for 50 years, that's how virologists proved there was a virus. Now, sometimes they would squirt it down a monkey's throat, or sometimes they would inject it into their liver or their abdomen, or different ways. But it's all the same. Now, in 1953, it's interesting, right before the Enders 54 cell culture, somebody had the bright idea of, let's take the tissue of a child who died from something else, right? Like a car accident. Took their spine, ground it up, put some same chemicals in it, injected it into 2 monkeys' brains. And you know what happened to the monkeys? They got died. Paralyzed and died.
Yeah.
Because apparently monkeys don't like having ground up spines injected into their brain.
Right.
And he said, this proves that the way we claimed that we found polio virus has been disproven.
Well, did they try doing healthy spine into the monkey's brain? And then they said,
not until 1953.
But then when they were like, the healthy spine's fine for the monkey.
No, the healthy spine caused paralysis.
Oh, it also did. So all of it did.
Killed the monkey.
So it didn't matter. Okay.
It didn't matter. They disproved that they proved that the problem with that experiment was monkeys don't like having 10 cc's of spine injected in their brain.
Right.
And then they said, well, this isn't the way to prove viruses. Then they had the cell culture. That's why they did it in 53.
Okay. So
now it's the same with all the other viruses. That's how they prove it. They take somebody they say has smallpox, which you can't tell the difference between smallpox and chickenpox and monkeypox and camel poop pox and all the rest of them.
Right.
And they take some stuff and they inject it into a rabbit and they see if it gets a lesion. And if it does, that's called proof of the existence of the virus.
Okay.
And not like some of the proteins in there, not some of the enzymes in there. There's like dead tissue in there. This isn't science. And if even the idea that if somebody gets sick in the same place as somebody else, that proves it's a virus, means...
What else would it be?
Well, I'll tell you. You put 100 rats in the basement. So in other words, the principle is same symptoms, same time, same place means it's contagious, right?
Well, if you're catching it from someone that you've had...
But you don't see catching. Right. All you see is same symptoms, same time, same place.
Right.
Right? Put 100 rats in the basement. Somebody puts rat poison. Next day, 100 rats all bleed to death. Same time, same symptoms, same place. Therefore, rat poison is a contagious disease caused by a microbe.
No, but if you didn't, there's a difference between food poisoning and a cold. So I could eat food poisoning with my family. We could all get food poisoning because we had the same meal. And that is, we don't have to deduce that came from a contagion. We could say, we all just ate the same bad food. But then there's when you don't eat the same bad food and you just happen to work close proximity with somebody else and you haven't eaten anything and you get sick after they're sick and then everybody else in the office gets sick and you didn't share any food.
The principle is same symptoms, same time, same place means contagion.
Well, I think it just means that there's something that caused you to get sick.
All right. So something.
Sure. But it doesn't,
something is different from a contagious microbe. You see, the reason this is important, Kim, is there have been actually 200 or so studies where they put people who are allegedly chickenpox, measles, mumps, etc., bird flu, I guess. I don't know if they did that one, and they put them in a room with healthy people, and they did controls, and 200 studies approximately say there was no contagion happened, including Spanish flu. And any listener out there who disagrees with me about that, you're going to have to send me a study showing we did a scientifically controlled study. We put 100 children with chickenpox with 100 well children. We proved contagion because we put them in the same room, like, so it's not like outgassing of the walls or some emotional thing. See, I'm not saying people don't communicate or transmit to each other. But the principle of same symptoms, same time, same place. Women menstruate at the same time, right?
Right.
Is that a virus?
Right. So I see what you're saying.
You have to prove that it's a contagious event.
Right. Right.
And we have tried that for 150 years. There's a whole book written, Can You Catch a Cold? 100 studies where people tried to prove that colds, flu, scarlet fever, strep throat, chickenpox, measles was a contagious event. And every single one says no. So somebody needs to send us a study showing, using the scientific method, that's the sick people were the independent variable, that's how it works. And I can guarantee there doesn't exist.
Well, but I think what people would say is immune system, right? Like you could put the sick person in a room and you're trying to prove contagion and not everybody gets it. So then I would deduce from that, well, then it must not be as contagious as must not be, because if it's a contagion, then everybody would get it. But then the answer to that the rebuttal to that is, well, immune system factors in and not everybody's going to catch it.
That's called a post hoc reasoning. In other words, they originally say everybody who's exposed to such and such a virus will get sick. Mm-hmm. And then they do an experiment like 1918 Spanish flu. They took 100 people who they said had the Spanish flu, 100 prisoners, they bribed them, who never had the Spanish flu, put them in the same room, they coughed in their mouth, they put snot up their nose, every way they could think of, and 0 got sick.
What do you mean 0? Not even one?
Not even one.
How is that possible?
Not even one. Boston Health Department. It's all over our website. Anybody can find the Rossino study. Boston Health Department, they repeated it in San Francisco. Not one person got sick. So they falsified that claim. And so then here's the way science works. You have to make what's called a post hoc reasoning, which means, why didn't it work? Well, those people must be immune.
Yeah.
And then, so that's really interesting because what do you mean? Well, they have antibodies, right? Mm-hmm. So antibodies mean you'll never get the sickness, right?
Right.
You get the measles, you get antibodies, you don't get sick. So measles, you get the antibodies, you never get sick. The flu, you get antibodies. Well, then you get sick the next year because the flu evaded. And then HIV, you make antibodies to it. And that means the virus is going to kill you. Hmm. And I remember hearing that when I graduated in 1984 from medical school. We proved that HIV is the cause of AIDS because we found antibodies in the blood of some people with AIDS and also pregnant women and people with the flu. And I remember thinking, wait a minute. I spent 4 years learning that antibodies mean I'm immune. And this nutcase Gallo just told me that antibodies mean I'm going to die from the illness. Oh. And I thought, what the fuck? Who changed the rule?
Right.
So this immune system is just a rationalization for having the claim being falsified.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm definitely buying more what you're selling this time around. So I can go with this, that they have not been able to prove that this exists. They're just they're going along with it. And
there is no proof that exists. You cannot prove there's no invisible unicorns.
Right. So, and
you have to prove there are, and they haven't.
Right. And they haven't been able to do that. This is not unique.
That's a problem.
It's sure, but it's not unique. I mean, in science, throughout history, there have been times where they've thought certain things, and then they were able to eventually, when they were able to empirically study things a little bit better, they were able to figure out, oh, we were wrong, and actually, this is the thing that's causing whatever it is, right?
It happened with contagion a lot. They used to say scurvy was an infectious disease, contagious. They used to say beriberi was an infectious disease, and they said it was they said pellagra was. They said over and over they've made the same mistake.
Yeah, scurvy is a good one. Let's talk about that, because scurvy is just a vitamin deficiency, right? Not getting enough citrus. Is that what it was on the ships?
So they saw thousands, probably millions of people, sailors, died, same symptoms, same time, same place.
Yeah.
Their teeth fell out. They went into heart failure and died. Yeah. They quarantined them. They fumigated them. They did prayers, etc. And then somebody said, I wonder if we give them a lemon, whether it gets better. That's the problem.
I wonder who that
Kim.
quack was.
That's the problem, Kim. This has real world consequences.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if you think it's a virus causing bird flu, not that they keep chickens in cages, they feed them poisoned food, they never see the sunlight, they never go outside, they overstimulate their egg laying, and on and on and on. I mean, it's amazing that chickens survive it.
Yeah.
And instead of that, they say, oh, it's the bird flu and we can't find the virus. And the way we find the virus is complete nonsense. So let's kill all the bird flu and the chickens and starve everybody from eggs. That's a problem.
Okay, Tom, I'm buying it. Scurvy is a really good example. You should use that one a lot. You should use that one more often, because that sells it. And you're right with bird flu. I mean, the bottom line is that they're like, oh, it hasn't it doesn't cross over to people. Well, why wouldn't it if it was a contagion?
Yeah, why would the whole thing is just one rationalization after another. Yeah. And why does it happen in the ones that they have in the cages with the horrible food, and they feed it all kind of chemicals and they never see light? I mean, the consequence of thinking like it's magical anti-scientific thinking is nobody asks the question, what is a healthy way to raise chickens? Not that way. And the chickens are going to get sick if you raise them that way.
Now I'm going to go into this more controversial territory, vaccines. So how is it, like with chickenpox vaccine, for example? I got the chickenpox. My generation got the chickenpox. Your generation got the chickenpox, right? Kids these days, I haven't seen a single kid get the chickenpox. They don't get them anymore because they started giving them the vaccine, which they shouldn't give. So I don't want to, here in the United States, we give it out. The UK doesn't. There's reasons why they don't. We probably shouldn't be doing it, but we are. And it is stopping kids from getting chickenpox.
So I spread unicorn repellent around my house because it's the unicorns that are blowing up people's houses. And not one of my houses has been blown up. So that's number one. Number two, we already went through that the CDC itself says you can't diagnose chickenpox or measles by the symptoms. And since we didn't have the test before about 1990, anything before 1990, we have no way of knowing whether they had chickenpox, measles, scarlet fever, roseola. Right.
But I'm not seeing little pockmarked kids running around. That's like, chickenpox looks frightening. I'm not seeing kids like that. Right. None of my nieces and nephews ended up with, I've got scars from my chickenpox. None of my nieces and nephews had chickenpox or any of those boils.
All you know is that you were sick and you had a fever and
a rash. And a really itchy rash that caused me to have scars.
None of that is specific to chickenpox.
Well, but I haven't seen that at all in my nieces and nephews. None of them have had these terrible looking boils, crop out all over their skin that itched and caused them to have scars. I haven't seen it.
So here's one way to look at this. So we have the wrong conception of illness in general. And again, I think we talked about this. You get a splinter in your finger and what happens? You make pus, right?
Yeah.
The pus is the therapy for the splinter. Agree?
Right. Yeah.
You breathe debris in your lungs, you cough it out, you get mucus, etc. You go to the doctor, he says you have bronchitis, but I think knowing how smart you are, you would say that's your body's way of getting rid of the debris.
Right.
So here you have children who have exposure to something. We don't know what it is. And it's also individual because it's not a clear-cut specific illness.
Yeah.
And they eliminate it through their skin. Now, you can come along and give them a drug or a strategy so that they stop eliminating it through their skin. Just like you can give somebody a drug called penicillin to stop them getting the debris out of their lungs. And you can give somebody another drug like a Staph aureus antibiotic so that they don't have pus to get the splinter out.
Interesting.
You haven't made them better.
Right.
You have made them sicker.
Yeah.
And the prediction will be those children will go on to have worse and chronic problems, which is exactly what happened.
Right. Which is why the UK says we don't really recommend this because it results in a terrible case of shingles later on. And
it results in sicker children.
Right. Okay.
Because if you stop people from getting the crap out of their lungs,
I see.
Here's how smart I am. They end up with crap in their lungs.
Yeah. Okay.
And the crap in their lungs, if you keep doing that over and over again, will form crap in the lung disease, which we misdiagnose as asthma.
Right. Okay.
And that's exactly what you see.
Yeah.
So it's not any sort of mystery. If you poison children, they won't go through simple, harmless elimination processes, which is exactly what seems to have happened.
Yeah, you're right. That does actually, when it comes to chickenpox and the UK's dispute with it, kind of really supports your case. And also with COVID, people who took the vaccine, the more they took it, the more likely they were to get COVID.
Right. And they get like cancers and so-called long COVID.
Yeah.
You know, we had a case the other day of because I have stopped believing in diseases and individual stories, right? So I always ask people what happened. So a guy comes in, he's like 80, and what happened? He was fine his whole life. 3 years ago, he gets a tumor in his salivary gland, right? What happened? Nothing. Did you take any drugs? Nothing. And then finally, at the end of this, his wife says, oh, by the way, you took a COVID shot 3 months and 1 month before this started.
Yeah.
So here's my guess as to what happened. He got injected with some really hard to digest toxic stuff, right? I don't even know what's in those things.
Right.
So the body in its wisdom put it in his salivary gland to try to get rid of, to try to digest it.
Mm-hmm.
It started to grow because it was hard to get rid of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that is misdiagnosed as a cancer. And you can see, if you think the body in its wisdom will try to deal with whatever you've given it, right? And here, what you gave it was some toxic poison. Put it in. He put it in his salivary gland to try to digest it.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear, and that's how you help people get better. If you say, I don't know, he got cancer, it must be genetic. It's not genetic. He poisoned himself.
Right. So I guess then the question is, they're continuing down this path with virology for, I would imagine it's lucrative. A lot of people have built their entire careers around it. So they don't want to suddenly realize that their career is, that they're studying a type of science that, that they're like on a sham track. And of course, there's a ton of money in virology with vaccines and cures and all these kinds of things. So
and fear.
Right. And fear. Yeah. So, so that's a problem, obviously.
It's a problem.
Okay.
And here's what's happening now. They're saying, oh, these old vaccines, which are basically just cell cultures broken down, put into vials. That's what a vaccine is. And it's expensive and dirty and it got all this crap in it. So they're keeping the model intact. They're specific diseases, and they're deadly, and they're caused by viruses. And now we're going to give you mRNA shots.
Yeah.
That's the Kennedy, Trump, Musk agenda.
Rather than just giving you a lemon.
Than giving you a lemon. Rather than saying, you know what, this whole thing is bullshit.
Yeah.
You don't need any of this stuff. And that's going to be lucrative, quick, clean. They can make them in 2 days. So there'll be a new virus, the Hanta pneumonia virus.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we all need vaccines and mRNA. They can make it in 2 months.
Right.
Hanta another $1 billion. And then this respiratory RSV virus, new one. That's the play here.
So maybe in 1,000 years, when they look back at our era, they're going to, they believe that there were that they thought that all of these illnesses were created by these viruses, these like unforeseen particles or whatever it was. And they believed that, and they were injecting themselves and doing all this weird stuff, when in reality, they just needed to eat lemons. I mean, that's kind of what.
That's it. I think you got it now. They needed to eat lemons and be outside and touch this, connect to the earth and have friends and talk about what's happening in their life and eat good food from chickens that scratch around in the earth and
I mean, there's
on and on.
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence that supports what you're saying. I mean, just by the sheer fact of, like with vaccines, people point out, like measles vaccine, for example, that measles was already drastically reducing by the time they rolled out the vaccine, and then they say, the vaccine did it. And it's like, how do you really know? It was already declining at a rapid rate.
What I'm trying to tell you is we didn't know who had measles.
Yeah.
If you factor that in, which is what the CDC says, you can't diagnose measles without a test.
Yeah.
They didn't have a test in 1940. So therefore, you can't diagnose measles. I mean, that doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure that one out. And so we don't know whether it did anything.
Yeah.
This is not complicated. You don't need to go into signals and all this confusing stuff.
Well, it's just that people aren't dying of scurvy anymore, for example. So, I mean, clearly there's illnesses that make us sick. Something is causing, clearly we get sick.
We get sick. Nobody's denying that.
Yeah. So what causes
a lot of things that probably are related to that? Like, I named some of them, but eating bad food and injecting yourself with poisons.
Right. Well, and what we learned with COVID is like just vitamin D, get outside, right? Like, and which they didn't let us do.
Right. And fear. Don't underestimate, it's interesting because I misspoke about these contagion studies earlier. I said none of them show that sick people make well people sick. There are 2 that did. And they were very interesting because what they did was they said, okay, this guy has a really serious illness, which we know is contagious, and we're going to stick some of his snot up your nose.
Uh-huh.
And then the next day they got sick.
Mm-hmm.
And then they told the people, you know what? We made a mistake. We actually gave you saline instead of the guy's snot who was really sick. 12 hours later, their symptoms were gone.
So psychology, you think, has a lot to do with it. I have a hard time with that one. I just can't believe that I got COVID, because that's what the other guest was talking about. Am I saying his name right? Was it Dr. I get, let me just check what was his name? Kui, was it Kui? Am I saying that name right? Because he was saying, it was just basically mass psychosis, that COVID basically was, everybody just was told by the news we were going to get sick. And so we all just got sick.
So I don't want to get into so-called replacement. I'm not telling you who your real parents are, right? Because then everybody will focus on, he's wrong about that. What I know is there's no specific illness and there's no virus.
Well, you can't say that there's no virus, though. You can't really say that.
There's no evidence that anybody showed that there's any SARS-CoV-2 exists.
But it could be. I mean, there could be a virus.
As far as we've done every test you can imagine, there's no evidence of a a particle called a virus.
But there's no evidence of anything. So, I mean, it could be. It could be.
There could be. There's the same probability as invisible exploding unicorns
Sure.
as the cause of all the houses in the Ukraine being blown up.
Sure. I mean, but it's possible.
Yes,
it's not plausible, but it's possible.
It's
okay.
Possible. And therefore, we should all go out and buy unicorn repellent.
Yeah. Right.
And so what, I don't know if in your case or anybody's case, whether it was psychological, suggestion. I know that they've been able to demonstrate that in careful scientific studies.
Yeah.
That's for sure. But it's also change in the electromagnetic field, change in the diet, change in the sunlight. There's a lot of things.
Yeah.
Why do I have to be simplistic and say, I know, Kim, it's you, you're a nutcase, and it was power of suggestion. I don't know that.
Okay. Right. And that's what he was asserting. He was kind of like, look, this wouldn't have ever spread like this. It's just not possible. So it just probably was psychosis. Like it was the power of suggestion.
No virus to spread.
Yeah. But you're saying, well, we don't know if it was the power of suggestion. Something very well could have caused everybody to get sick. We just don't know what it was. Like, we're not going to say it's a virus. We're not going to say it was power of suggestion from Fox News or CNN, all of them at the same time.
I know one
giving
thing that made people get sick is the shots. And I know another thing was putting them on ventilators.
Yeah.
And I know another thing was remdesivir.
Right.
And I know another thing was intubating people.
Yeah.
And I know another thing was driving ambulances all over cities with screening their sirens all night.
Yeah.
Those things make people sick. And they're pretty easily to demonstrate, unlike a virus.
Yeah. Okay. I'm more sold this time around. I got to tell you, I am. I'm more sold on this. Yeah. So, I mean, especially their cures. Their cures don't. A lot of people are questioning the cures, and they're questioning of the vaccines. And those questioning, there's a lot of evidence that children who don't ever get any vaccines are healthier or just as healthy or whatever, right? And it doesn't have. So there's a lot of evidence
for what I'm saying.
Well, yeah, because their cures, if their cures don't work, then what is it? Then what are they?
And you don't have the right solution. The problem is,
right.
You can't cure scurvy by quarantining people
or giving them a vaccine.
Giving a vaccine for unicorns.
Yeah, they just needed to eat limes. Okay. Very interesting.
I know the final thing. The last thing that gets people is, okay, so this guy does make some sense. He's a little bit quirky and he has a funny vest, and all, but I know my doctor, and I grew up with the guy who became a virologist. These are really smart people. He must be missing something.
Yeah.
Fine. Show me the study that shows that how you isolate a virus, that they did using the scientific criteria and method. Show me that sick people make well people sick. Show me the study, and I will come back on your show and say, you know what, Kim, I got it wrong. And nobody will do that because they don't exist. Why is this happening? God only knows.
Okay.
But it ain't fun.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Dr. Tom Cowan, thank you for being here and
all right, Kim.
And explaining this. I don't know if you explained it better this time or if I was just more receptive to it this time. I'm not sure. It's just like the existence of the virus. We won't know. We won't know which it was. But this made sense to me this time around. And I think probably for those watching as well, that right, we could just be, it's kind of, and there's plenty of examples of this throughout history with science. So this is not, this isn't like
not a unique.
Right. It's not unique. So it should be plausible to everybody that, yeah, they got this wrong. They've gotten many things wrong. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Dr. Tom Cowan, I've got the link down below to your site. and you've got many books, and I've also got the link down there for people to follow you on X. Is there anywhere else you want people to go besides your site and X?
That's fine.
Okay.
I really appreciate it, Kim. You know, it's really a wonderful and unique person who's going to say, I just want to try to figure this out. And you should be really applauded for just, no matter what you think now, I'm really going to try to think my way through this.
Well, thank you so much for helping me think through this, and those watching as well. I think it's important to have people like yourself that are willing to challenge the mainstream, ideologues and what they claim is absolute science. And we've heard that, and the thing is that I think you're in a position now where people are more receptive to it, because we heard this is the science during the pandemic, and many of us saw they were full of shit. Yeah. And so now we're more receptive to, I don't know if you really, when you're telling me something's a science, is it though? Is it? Right. Maybe it isn't.
Yeah. Let me see what you did here. Yeah.
Thank you again for being here. Really appreciate it.